parte da escravidão negra do Brasil, da OAB, uma comissão aberta, não é? Que abriga pessoas que não são necessariamente advogadas por profissão. E por muitas razões importantíssimas, sobretudo porque esta é uma luta que envolve todas as pessoas, sendo elas alvos do preconceito, do racismo, da discriminação, ou sendo elas as pessoas privilegiadas que fazem com que esta discriminação, este estado de coisas continue. Então, quem não está, quem desses privilegiados não estiver ao lado de quem luta contra a discriminação racial, contra o racismo e pela justa reparação dos povos africanos em todo o mundo, está contribuindo para a continuação de o que eu considero a situação mais fundante da travestia de direitos humanos, da destruição da vida em massa de pessoas, que continua a afetar a vida de tantos no mundo. Então, é preciso que todos estejam engajados nessa causa. Muitas vezes, quando eu estou numa mesa onde tem preponderância de pessoas brancas, em algumas ocasiões, tem acontecido o seguinte: as pessoas dizem para mim, mas o que trouxe você para essa luta? Por que você está nisso aí? Por que você está falando de racismo? Porque muitas vezes outras pessoas estão falando de... Muitas vezes outras pessoas estão falando de outros assuntos de direitos humanos que quase sempre julgam mais importantes do que o combate ao racismo. No meu entender, o racismo anti-africano e anti-negro é um racismo específico e é o racismo que mais estrutura toda a supremacia branca que se dirige contra outros povos também. E é o que mais estraga vidas e potencialidades humanas no mundo. Quando a gente pensa, Kiratiana, obrigada a você também pelo convite. Quando a gente pensa, Kiratiana, no número, nos milhões de vidas que o racismo e o legado colonialista antinegro destrói, a única coisa que a gente pode fazer é tentar contribuir para reparar esses danos. E, nesse sentido, apesar da minha cara de madame, apesar, enfim, dessa minha condição de origem, se eu for contar toda a história de por que eu entrei nessa vida, nessa luta especificamente, vai levar muito tempo, mas eu quero deixar uma referência para vocês que vêm dos Estados Unidos, para vocês que vêm do estudo do direito, né? Advogados negros da Universidade de Pensilvânia. Eu tenho também uma formação em Direito nos Estados Unidos, na Universidade do Estado de Nova York. Eu quero trazer para vocês só o fato de que a minha... muito obrigada. Sim. de que a minha inserção nesse combate vem, em parte, da minha procedência de uma cidade que é perto de um lugar chamado Ática, na região ocidental do estado de Nova York, onde existe uma penitenciária estadual que, em 1971, testemunhou, experimentou uma rebelião dos presos que não se submeteram, não quiseram mais se submeter às condições desumanas impostas a eles, que eram 95% negros, alguns outros porto-riquenhos, latinos, indígenas e alguns pouquinhos brancos. Eles tomaram reféns, 8 reféns. No curso da rebelião, que durou várias semanas, e na repressão dessa rebelião pelas tropas da Guarda Estadual do estado de Nova York, cujo governador na época era Nelson Rockefeller, houve 42 mortes. Dessas 42 mortes, 5 foram de reféns. Todas as mortes foram causadas, e isso ficou provado depois de muitos anos de duros trabalhos, ficou provado oficialmente que todas as mortes foram causadas pela repressão do Estado. No entanto, foram os presos rebelados que foram acusados oficialmente, levados à justiça, por todas essas mortes e todos os outros crimes que aconteceram no curso da rebelião. Para vocês, eu então, na época, já estava engajada em questões contra o apartheid na África do Sul e também da Guerra de Vietnã. E aí eu voltei da minha cidade, da universidade onde eu estava estudando, para participar na defesa política e jurídica desses presos acusados de todas as mortes e todos os incidentes que aconteceram no curso dessa rebelião. Hoje, nós temos uma situação até um pouco diferente, porque naquela época, as penitenciárias eram majoritariamente essas instituições de Estado. E nós temos hoje uma situação, Adame, em que a prisão passou a ser uma indústria de lucro nos Estados Unidos, onde se ganha dinheiro em cima do quê? Em cima exatamente do aprisionamento e da violência perpetrada consistentemente contra a comunidade negra e homens e mulheres negras. Então, o racismo continua da mesma forma como o principal fator de desigualdade. Eu diria não só nos Estados Unidos, como também no Brasil, né? Eu sou norte-americana, né? Muita gente no Brasil não me conhece tanto como tal. Então, para mim, assim, eu estou aqui nessa mesa numa situação um pouco diferente do que eu costumo. Mas, a partir dessa atuação na defesa jurídica e política desses presos levantados, quer dizer, no processo judicial perpetrado contra esses presos, eu já havia morado no Brasil, já havia me apaixonado pelo Brasil antes de conhecer a pessoa que seria o meu marido, que se chama Abdias do Nascimento, que naquela época estava na cidade de Buffalo, atuando como professor da Universidade do Estado de Nova York, em Buffalo, e a partir dessa minha atuação na defesa dos irmãos de Ática, foi a primeira vez também que eu ouvi falar o nome de um dos deuses do candomblé, da tradição africana no Brasil, que se chama candomblé, que é Xangô, porque um dos irmãos se chamava Xangô, falava Xangô, né? Em inglês é Xangô, mas eu conheci esse cara somente uma vez. Eu pude visitá-lo, mas o nome dele era Xangô. E aí eu fui conhecer o Web Dias. Muito bem. O nome do meu marido foi mencionado por Ruth Pinheiro, né? Na parte da manhã. Naquela época, ele estava engajado nesse combate ao racismo a nível internacional, pelo panafricanismo, e muito ativista, né? Levando, na verdade, ao palco assim, do mundo africano, a denúncia, os fatos sobre o racismo no Brasil, porque o Brasil havia conseguido se erguer, e eu soube muito recentemente de pessoas que vieram, inclusive, eu lembro que foi a Susan Rice, que veio aqui, né, quando ela estava na administração Obama, e numa pequena reunião ela dizia, olha, eu mesma conhecia a notícia do Brasil como sendo um grande país da harmonia racial, onde existe uma convivência maravilhosa entre negros e brancos, etc. e tal. Então, esta imagem prevalecia, e grande parte do trabalho no âmbito do mundo africano era levar aos ativistas panafricanistas o conhecimento e os fatos, né, sobre o racismo no Brasil, sobre como essa imagem foi construída por uma elite branca que tinha um interesse muito específico em perpetrar essa imagem. Então, eu pude participar, de alguma forma, dessa iniciativa, desse esforço, né? Antes, assim, um mês ou dois antes de eu conhecê-lo, o Web Dias havia participado do 6º Congresso Pan-Africano em Tanzânia. E nesta reunião foi a primeira vez em que houve uma voz da população de origem africana, da América Latina, entre aspas, né? Dentro de um congresso internacional panafricanista. Inclusive, houve um esforço de se dedicar um dia ao caso do Brasil, pelo fato de o Brasil ter a população negra maior do mundo fora da Nigéria. É uma população que naquela época era contada, era subcontada, né? Porque as pessoas, o censo pedia para as pessoas se identificarem basicamente branco, preto, pardo e amarelo. Aí as pessoas, por causa da pesada influência do supremacismo branco, eram levadas a se identificar mais claros. E aí, então, aquela pessoa mais escura iria se identificar como pardo. E a pessoa mais clara, né, iria se identificar muitas vezes como branca. É bem parecido com o que nós conhecemos como passing, né? Só que a hierarquia de cor é mais, como é que se diz, mais cortadinha, né? Você tem diferentes, né, gradações de cor. E o racismo é o mesmo racismo. Os sociólogos brasileiros quiseram dizer que isto não é racismo. Isto aí é apenas uma preferência estética, né? Então não é racismo. Racismo é só quando você tem uma bipolaridade, como existe nos Estados Unidos, onde você ou é branco ou é preto, mesmo a pessoa mais clara é identificada como negra. Bom, isso aí é uma questão muito complicada e o fato é que pouco depois disso, nos anos em 77, nós tivemos a honra e o privilégio de participar do primeiro Congresso de Cultura Negra das Américas, que foi realizado em Cali, na Colômbia, e foi a primeira conferência internacional de grande porte que que reunia os afrodescendentes na América chamada Latina, né, para cuidar dos seus assuntos específicos. A grande liderança foi o colombiano Manuel Zapata Oliveira, e o segundo Congresso de Cultura Negra das Américas foi em Panamá, no ano de 1980. Nesse congresso de 1980, Abdias do Nascimento, eu não pude ir, né? Eu estava fazendo direito, tinha que ficar fazendo cursos para terminar. Mas ele foi e apresentou uma tese que ele chamou de quilombismo. O quilombismo é uma proposta que eu considero uma expressão de uma proposta de reparação. Por quê? Porque vai além da ideia de políticas públicas ou de ação afirmativa e propõe uma forma de organização do próprio Estado-nação brasileira, ou de qualquer nação multirracial e pluriétnica, multirracial e pluricultural, né, onde você tem uma pesada presença de população africana, porque em todos esses lugares, como nos mostra Richard Price e vários autores que têm escrito sobre o fenômeno dos quilombos, que nos Estados Unidos chamam Maroon Societies, na Jamaica também Maroon Societies, que em Cuba e Colômbia se chamam palenques, que no México se chamam cimarrones, e por aí vai. É um fenômeno que cobre toda a região geográfica em que houve a escravidão africana nas Américas. Então, este fenômeno é algo que muitos autores, antes do Abdias, já haviam mostrado como a organização social, econômica, jurídica, política dessas comunidades, que não eram simplesmente redutos de escravos fugidos. Essa era a frase, né, Dami? Que existia quando tinha menção né? Nos livros convencionais, assim, didáticos, etc. e tal, se falava que o quilombo era um reduto de escravos fugidos, certo, Nelson Joaquim? Não é? E não era isso, era a construção de uma vida em liberdade, era a construção de uma vida coletiva de quem não aceitava o estado de escravidão. Então, o maior quilombo que existiu durante mais tempo nas Américas foi o de Palmares, aqui no Brasil, que desde 1595, se constituía como a soma de um grupo de quilombos, hoje, estados de Alagoas e Pernambuco. A região, o território de Palmares cobre mais da metade desses dois estados e tinha um centro de resistência na Serra da Barriga, que era um planalto de onde as pessoas poderiam ver ao redor e, portanto, estrategicamente planejar suas defesas contra os ataques que eles sofreram durante 100 anos, até 1695. Durante 100 anos, Palmares resistiu à agressão colonialista de Portugal, de Holanda, porque a Holanda veio aqui ao Brasil invadir grande parte do Nordeste brasileiro, quis estabelecer sua soberania ali, e também os chamados bandeirantes brasileiros, ou seja, ainda a colônia, claro, mas os militares que reprimiam os quilombos e que eram, na verdade, bandidos, né? No fundo, era a milícia da época, não é, o Adame? A milícia da época eram os bandeirantes, que acabaram finalmente, depois de muitos anos de guerra, Zumbi, o líder de Palmares, sucumbiu na luta em 1695. Vejam, qual é o ano em que se considera que os Estados Unidos, as colônias dos Estados Unidos recebem os primeiros africanos? Alguém pode me ajudar? Eu acho que é 1600 e o quê? 19, 1630 e alguma coisa? Alguém? Oi? Primeiros africanos escravizados chegando nos Estados Unidos. Oi? 1619, obrigada, 1619. Então, você tem 24 anos atrás, antes disso, já o maior coleção de quilombos formados aqui no Brasil, né, resistindo à escravidão. Então, é uma história muito longa, é uma população muito grande. Eu já provavelmente esgotei o meu tempo, não sei. Tá, mais uns 2 minutinhos. Então, o que eu quero dizer é o seguinte, sobre a reparação entre Estados Unidos e Brasil, um fenômeno que eu acho que existe no Brasil, além dessa forma diferente de organizar um racismo que não se assume, um racismo que não se explicita, um racismo que é subterrâneo, mas é tão, ou talvez por isso até pior, porque você nega ao alvo desse racismo a sua própria condição oprimido, portanto, sujeito de direitos, né? Além disso, ou talvez parte disso, existe o fato de que a documentação, o registro histórico no Brasil é muito precária. Em parte também porque os pesquisadores, até muito recentemente, não se interessavam muito. Então, nós temos, por exemplo, algumas manifestações e registros da luta antirracista, anti-escravista de negros brasileiros que estão só agora começando a ser realmente conhecidos, né? A carta, o Adame escapou para buscar café. Eu estou esquecida do nome da escrava, cuja petição... Esperança Garcia, né? É um exemplo, né? Só muito recentemente nós temos tido acesso à documentação. Enquanto nos Estados Unidos, me parece que os registros históricos, por mais precários que sejam, existem e estão mais acessíveis, né? Então, eu acredito que ainda vai haver novas oportunidades de documentarmos a história da luta pela reparação no Brasil. Eu sei que existem alguns documentos, eu tive a honra de escrever um pequeno texto para esse livro aqui. Eu não posso oferecer, infelizmente, porque tem muito poucos exemplares, mas foi um congresso lindo feito em Brasília, o segundo deles juntando indígenas, nativos, povos originários e também negros, em Brasília, e fiz uma pequena pesquisa que só me deu vontade de continuar mais, sobre quilombismo e reparação. E aí tem vários... tem uma... Oh, meu Deus. Ana Lúcia Araújo. Eu sabia que era Ana Lúcia. Mas Ana Lúcia Araújo tem um livro sobre reparação, em inglês, Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, publicado em 2017, é uma referência importantíssima para todo mundo. Eu, infelizmente, não tive tempo de conhecer a pesquisa dela em detalhe, mas eu sei que ela levantou várias referências históricas à luta pelas reparações no Brasil e em Cuba. Muito bem. Então, eu acredito que vai haver no futuro mais levantamento sobre essa questão. O que eu queria trazer para vocês, e talvez eu possa, tendo tempo, se vocês se interessarem, compartilhar com vocês esse pequeno texto, Quilombismo e Reparação da Escravidão. O quilombismo vem a ser, essa tese que Dias do Nascimento apresenta no segundo Congresso de Cultura Negra das Américas, em Panamá, em 1980, que, aliás, é interessante porque é o mesmo ano em que Molefe Asante publica a primeira edição do seu trabalho Afrocentricity, nos Estados Unidos, Afrocentricidade. O quilombismo para além de uma proposta de ações afirmativas ou de políticas públicas, é uma proposta de organização de um Estado democrático, de direito, capaz de se basear nas tradições democráticas de origem africana e indígena e incluir, não somente incluir, mas se constituir da população negra e indígena com suas tradições. Então, este aqui é o livro da Ana Lúcia Araújo, brasileira, da Howard University, não é?
Yeah.
Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade. Então, tem toda uma história que eu não vou poder passar, mas, assim, para concluir, eu quero oferecer a vocês compartilhar esse ensaio, pequeno ensaio, se puder. O livro, O Quilombismo, está à disposição na mesa com Milson Santos, ali fora. Eu confesso, como norte-americana, agora eu vou fazer a minha fala de norte-americana, o Adame, que eu tenho muito pouca esperança no Estado norte-americano quando se trata da questão da reparação da escravidão a médio prazo. Porque o Estado, o país, foi fundado sobre a unificação do país depois de uma guerra civil, dependeu não daquela ideia que nós brancos nos Estados Unidos temos sempre como uma feliz recordação, né? 40 acres and a mule, não é? Aquela ideia de que a reconstrução, aquele programa que foi um pedaço de um programa de reparação... Isso aqui tem açúcar?
Não sei, acho que sim.
Não. De um programa um programa de reparações, isso sim, para os brancos que perderam suas propriedades na guerra. E teve uma parte desse programa que era destinado a pegar terras que o governo federal havia confiscado de alguns desses escravistas e, a partir dessas terras, distribuir algumas terras para os destituídos, os negros recém-libertos pela guerra. Mas acontece que essa política teve uma vida muito curta. Ao contrário da noção que a gente recebe, viu? A gente recebe uma noção de que, não, nos Estados Unidos eles deram uma compensação. Não, aquilo foi um pedaço muito pequeno. E depois veio o Andrew Johnson, que sucedeu ao Abraham Lincoln, e aboliu aquela política, na mesma hora. E a unificação dos Estados Unidos se funda numa decisão judicial chamada Plessy versus Ferguson, que é onde você estabelece a segregação racial nos Estados Unidos, porque aquele país é fundado sobre a supremacismo branca. Eu não consigo nem falar. A supremacia branca é o que funda aquela nação. Hoje nós estamos vivendo toda essa situação que estamos vivendo. Então, assim, qual é a conclusão? A conclusão que a gente chega é, sim, como hoje de manhã eu vi falar, é necessário que as organizações, os movimentos negros, para avançarmos na agenda da reparação, é sim uma vitória que hoje nós temos numa campanha eleitoral, candidatos brancos falando na questão da reparação. É um avanço, mas não vamos, sabe, é um avanço, mas o que, na verdade, tudo que se conseguiu até agora, efetivamente, foi construído pela população negra nos Estados Unidos, construindo as suas próprias instituições, as suas próprias iniciativas e puxando todas essas agendas de direito. Então, aqui no Brasil, o que eu me dedico a tentar fazer é contribuir para a possibilidade de reforçarmos o legado o legado político, cultural, de tradição africana, através de uma pequena tentativa, que é continuar o Instituto de Pesquisa e Estudos Afro-Brasileiros, que é uma instituição que eu tive a honra de ajudar Abdias Nascimento a fundar. E, para concluir, eu gostaria de pedir duas coisas. Que vocês assistam um pequeno vídeo de 3 minutos e que a gente distribua esse texto aqui para poder as pessoas ouvir a poesia de Milson Santos.
Em português tem...
Nós temos o texto da poesia em inglês para vocês poderem acompanhar. E o vídeo já está com o nosso amigo... Como é o nome dele? Cujo nome, infelizmente, eu esqueci. Eu quero convidar as pessoas que estão na mesa para descer ali, porque senão não vão ver o vídeo. Vamos dar um tempinho para as pessoas poderem descer. E também podemos desligar as luzes aqui em cima da mesa. The people who are up here are not going to see the video. Okay, yeah. Vamos descer. So I have some
Luto, tradição.
Para mim é história. O que é hip afro?
Luto, tradição.
Para mim é história.
Ancestralidade. Resistência.
Luta. Né? Luta pela memória, luta pela dignidade, luta pela presença do negro de uma forma mais ampla dentro da sociedade.
Abdias, a entidade responsável pela manutenção do legado de Abdias Nascimento. O legado desse que foi, na minha visão, o principal líder afro-brasileiro no século XX e um dos principais, evidentemente, de toda a nossa história.
Eu vejo a história do Abdias Nascimento na história também de muitos brasileiros, assim como eu.
Hip afro, para mim, é conhecimento.
Básico para uma nova educação.
A meta do hip afro é contribuir para a continuidade dessa luta de combate ao racismo, com ênfase na necessidade de trazer para as escolas, para a educação, para as novas gerações, o conhecimento do que significa o legado da cultura africana e negra.
Tanto quem estuda em colégio público como privado tem-se a ver tanto a Europa como os Estados Unidos como o centro do mundo, né? E não, quando a gente vai conhecer o projeto que o IPAFRO desenvolve, você vê o protagonismo do africano à frente da ciência, da astronomia, da medicina.
A linha do tempo dos povos africanos mostra como os povos africanos vêm construindo conhecimento e cultura durante muitos milênios, um tempo muito maior do que o tempo em que eles foram escravizados. Realizamos oficinas para educadores, mostrando e desenvolvendo junto com eles formas de levar esses conteúdos para a sala de aula.
Posso sintetizar como democratização da informação e do conhecimento.
O IPAFRO guarda a memória de uma corrente de luta de um século inteiro.
Recorte de jornal,
correspondência a ex-presidentes,
textos escritos pelo Abdias, entrevistas que ele deu.
E o teatro experimental do negro como um ponto de ruptura na cena teatral brasileira, isso também é de um valor inquestionável.
Eu acho que o que a gente vê aqui no acervo faz a gente pensar como é isso de diariamente, né, que é muito essa questão da afrocentricidade, né, como que é a sua conduta no dia a dia.
Além de ser um arquivo, é um lugar de memória, é um lugar de encontro e um lugar de produção também.
A partir desse acervo museológico que tem obras de arte, tanto produzidas pelo próprio Abdias, como também peças colecionadas pelo projeto do Museu de Arte Negra, nós temos feito exposições em várias cidades.
Foram exposições, foram concursos, tudo que aviva a memória.
Quando eu entrei no IPAFRA, eu tinha uma ideia de uma instituição que, para mim, falava sobre o Abdias. E hoje em dia eu vejo que é mais que isso.
É uma organização que trabalha, então, com os problemas que nós temos, que nós enfrentamos no Brasil no momento, que procura soluções para esses problemas. Agora, no espírito do Abdias.
Uma nova visão do povo brasileiro, aprendendo a se enxergar melhor.
Eu sou na medida que todo coletivo é. E IPAFRA, para mim, é sinônimo de Umbuto.
Vamos voltar para a mesa? Vai no sul.
Antes de fazer a poesia, eu quero agradecer a Dani, agradecer a toda essa família da OAB que tem essa iniciativa incrível e tão fundamental para nós continuarmos. Thank you. Então, agradecer a você, Adame, e a todos e todas que estão presentes aqui nesse momento que se fala da reparação da escravidão. Eu acho que é o tema mais pertinente para a realidade preta do Brasil e do mundo, né? É o assunto que a gente tem que pautar cada vez mais. Mas antes de começar com a poesia, eu quero exercitar a honestidade. Tem uma caneta linda e maravilhosa que parou em minha mesa e eu gostaria de saber se tem o dono ou a dona está aqui. Se não tiver, será uma linda doação, eu vou ficar muito feliz. Mas eu primeiro tenho que tentar ser honesto aqui. Não? Então tá lá na mesa, viu? Se vocês conhecerem, se alguém chegar perguntando, tá, a caneta tá na mão. Racismo é a prática mais genocida de todos os tempos. Fato. Cumprindo seu maior objetivo, segue invisibilizando o povo preto de África, a diáspora, num número incalculável. Por isso, na hora do feio, do odiável, do tenebroso, do rejeitável, do fudido, do desgraçado, em primeiro, se não único lugar, vem desenhado preto em nosso pensamento enquanto colonizado. Vejam o que os europeus fizeram com os originários, destruíram diversas tribos, mataram milhares de nativos. Vejam, diariamente na tela da TV tem preto favela contra preto favela contra preto fardado. E tem gente da gente que só porque está estudando em uma universidade ou acessou um cargo na prefeitura ou no estado, já não coloca mais os pés na favela, fica na primeira pessoa do singular, posando de intelectualoide diferenciado. Enquanto a mídia faz piadas, funerárias vendem, floriculturas vendem e nossas mães prosseguem enterrando seus filhos, nossos irmãos assassinados. Se for gordo e tiver uma vida sexoafetiva que não seja hétero, sofre. Se for gordo, tiver uma vida sexoafetiva que não seja hétero e for preto, sofre dobrado. Se for mulher, o machismo agride. Se essa mulher for preta, o machismo junta seu sexismo com o suporte do racismo e faz com que essa mulher sofra seu bocado. Racismo é estruturante e, sobretudo, é extremamente estruturado. Apesar de nossas conquistas, a palavra denegrir segue o mesmo sentido no dicionário, que significa tornar mais negro, que é igual a manchar a reputação. Minha irmã, meu irmão, racismo não dá intervalo. A corda ainda só quebra do lado mais afro. E no degradê de melanina fui guiado para me sentir fraco, e incapacitado, entre tantos absurdos, nos ensina a fugir para o moreno escuro ou para o moreno claro. A luta antirracista é uma luta para todos e todas, sejam alvos ou privilegiados, porque racismo provocador, dor que produz revolta, revolta que forma indignados, indignados cada vez mais estratégicos, estratégicos cada vez mais articulados, articulados cada vez mais Xangô, Xangô cada vez mais machado, machado de dois gumes bem afiados de ambos os lados. Justiça seja feita nesse acerto de contas inevitável. Eu desejo o menor dos estragos. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Nilson. Vamos retomar. Elisa, então, para você finalizar, e logo em seguida a Olivia Beta, que puxa a apresentação dos nossos amigos norte-americanos.
Sim, eu finalizo, entrego a mesa, só dizendo o seguinte, que eu quero desejar aos estudantes norte-americanos que estão aqui, da Universidade de Pensilvânia, estudantes de Direito, né, que vocês tenham muito sucesso e, com certeza, venham a contribuir para essa longa caminhada em busca da reparação da maior injustiça que existe, pelo menos nos Estados Unidos, e eu acredito que no mundo. Obrigada.
Acender a luz, então. Olivia, it's your time. Então, agora, Olivia Bétia, que é coordenadora estudantil da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade da Pensilvânia, que vai fazer a apresentação do grupo de estudantes que veio especificamente para fazer isso, Reparação da Escravidão, Brasil e Estados Unidos.
Hi everyone, I'm going to ask, I'll ask all my colleagues if you can sit over here, unless you are in the immediate group that's presenting, and then we can just trade off seats as we advance to groups 2 and 3.
You want to see another video?
Vamos. Olá, bom dia. Muito obrigada. O meu nome é Magali. We are going to be talking about reparations in the United States. We're very excited to be here. We are all from the University of Pennsylvania. We are from the Black Law Students Association, and we really appreciate the invitation to be here today. We are going to go through a comparative analysis of the administration of slavery reparations. First, we will talk about the case for reparations for Black slavery in the United States. We'll talk a little bit about the history so that you can understand the background. Next, we'll talk about how do we implement reparations in the United States. And we'll talk about some of the conversations that have been going on throughout the decades. Next, and finally, we'll talk about a case study, the Namibia case that Humberto mentioned earlier. So first, we're going to talk about the history of the United States and the history of slavery and how that has impacted the Black population in the United States today. First, we want to find out who was harmed and how. It seems like an easy question, but it's actually very complex. We've seen in Brazil that there are different ways of understanding what Blackness means, whether that's on the census or whether that is just in day-to-day life of how you identify with Blackness. And so in the US, we have different ways of understanding that, and a lot of it ties back to slavery. First, we're going to talk about slavery and Reconstruction. Then we will talk about Jim Crow and the legal institution that occurred. And finally, we'll talk about modern-day disenfranchisement, so different ways that the Black population has been disenfranchised by the government and by our legal institutions. So there's a question mark around 1619. And as Elisa Larkin mentioned, 1619 is usually associated with the beginning of slavery in the United States, with the first arrival of a slave ship in Jamestown, Virginia. This slave ship was supposedly the first one. However, some historians believe that there were previous arrivals on a Spanish ship in 1526. However, that hasn't been a huge part of our narrative. So we're not sure exactly what is the date, but we do want to highlight that there isn't a set narrative. Next, just to talk a little bit about what slavery looked like in terms of the laws. In 1682, the Virginia legislature enacted a law that said that all people of color arriving to the United States would be enslaved. And then in 1668, the Virginia legislature said that corporal punishment was legal. So slaves were allowed to be beaten and treated poorly. And so we see that the United States started off with legalizing the corporal punishment of Black people. Next, we want to talk a little bit about hypodescent, and that is the sociological term for what we know as the one-drop rule. And as Elisa Larkin also mentioned, in the United States, 1 drop of Black blood means you're Black. That is the common understanding of Blackness in America. And so that was enshrined in the legislature in 1705, when Virginia stated that interracial marriage was prohibited. And the reasons for that were that if you had some sort of maternal lineage to Blackness, that means that you were Black. And so it was defined in terms of the status of the mother, which is interesting because in England, it was with the father. And so that was a reversal once the United States was established. Next, that scheme had several economic benefits for the white settlers. That meant that they did not have paternal responsibilities, and that meant that they had a new slave if white settlers mixed with Black slaves. Just skipping through to talk a little bit about abolition and the US Constitution after the Civil War. The Civil War in the US, just to give context, was from 1861 to 1865. And it was a division between the North and the South. The North wanted to abolish slavery, and the South did not. So Dred Scott was an important decision leading up to the Civil War. It's an important case in the legal history of the United States. It essentially said that a black slave could not be free. So that was a decade-long struggle that went to the Supreme Court. After the Civil War ended in 1865, there were new additions to the Constitution. We call them amendments, and we specifically call them the Reconstruction Amendments. So we have the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all formerly enslaved people, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited racial exclusion. So we thought. Next, again, we mentioned a little bit about 40 acres and a mule. This is the first time in US history that we mention what we call today reparations. It's the idea that formerly enslaved people needed some sort of land to own, land that they previously worked on, in order to move forward and be members of society. The federal government confiscated 400,000 acres of land and was going to distribute that amongst formerly enslaved people. I'm going to skip through a little bit because I know we're short on time. However, that program was never implemented because the successor, Johnson, Lincoln's successor, Johnson, failed to enact that program. However, there was an additional effort to provide some sort of economic relief and economic program towards formerly enslaved people called the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a program sponsored by the government which launched banks so that black people could start saving money. And it actually opened a lot of banks, up to 34 banks, during the time that it was in enactment. And however, there was a crisis and it failed. So it wasn't very long term, and it was seen as a failure of the government to truly invest in the economic prosperity of black people. The end of Reconstruction was around 1877. And throughout that next generation, we see legal disenfranchisement of black people in different ways. Through a lack of political participation, through the government declining to intervene in racial violence, and there were a lot of lynchings that occurred. Up to every 2 or 3 days, there were lynchings in the South, and it was a very traumatic part of US history, which continued for a long time, and the government didn't really do anything to prevent it. So despite having the 14th Amendment, it was severely limited. Voting rights were not really guaranteed, even though they were supposed to be. And racial segregation was reestablished with Plessy v. Ferguson, which my colleague will talk about now. Thank you.
Thank you, Magali, for getting us kicked off. I will be talking about the beginning, so from the end of Reconstruction into the beginning of the Jim Crow era. So the Jim Crow era is the notable period immediately after slaves were freed. There was common thought that, my name is Justin Pendleton, apologies. So it was a thought that the abolishment of slavery would set African Americans and freed slaves on the path to equal citizenship. But as the Confederates began to re-enter the Union and be elected into local and state governments, that quickly became not true. And it became not true through the Jim Crow era, which started in the mid-1860s and ran all the way up to the Civil Rights era, the height of the Civil Rights era, which was the 1950s, 1960s. And so one of the initial movements within the Jim Crow era were the establishment of black codes. These black codes started at the local and the state level, particularly in the southern states of the United States of America. And they were designed to maintain the traditions of antebellum South and the traditions that existed under American slavery and American chattel slavery, so as to say that white Americans were superior to all other races, but especially that of Negro or mulatto blood. A couple of ways that we've highlighted and that were most harmful to the plight of African Americans and newly freed slaves in establishing their citizenship were in the form of vagrancy laws. And so vagrants are those who are unemployed or seen as unhelpful to the local establishment. And so all free Negroes and mulattoes over the age of 18 who were found to be unemployed or who were found to unlawfully assemble, meaning just exist, just be in groups of 2 or 3, would be fined. And they would be fined anywhere from $50, which in today's terms means something like $790 US, just for standing or just for being unemployed. And if they couldn't pay because they were unemployed, they would be imprisoned. Or if they weren't imprisoned, they would be hired out. So they would basically be sold back to white business owners and white tradesmen until they could pay, so they could work off their debt. The pernicious part, the hard part, was that there was no limit on the number of times that you could be charged with vagrancy. So as long as every time that you worked off your debt, if you were found to be unemployed and didn't have a labor contract, you could just be charged again and sent back to a white business owner or a tradesman. A corollary, in addition to the vagrancy laws, were apprenticeship laws, which applied to children, which applied to Negro and mulatto children. And so for those who didn't have parents who were orphans or who were dependent on the state, they could also be sold out, hired out to white tradesmen and white business owners until their debt had been paid. And so economically, you can see that if you're always working to pay off your debt, forced to pay off your debt that's been made up, you can never accumulate your own wealth. You can never move forward in society and achieve and use the rights of citizenship. Next from there, we go to one of the largest and most important cases in all of American legal history, Plessy v. Ferguson. In this case, it transpires, it arrives in the state of Louisiana, in New Orleans, where this man at the bottom of the screen, Homer Plessy, decided that he wanted to sit in the car with the white patrons. So at this time, Louisiana had established a law that there was a car for whites and there was a car for everyone else. And he being, as he proclaimed, 7/8 white, decided that he was going to sit in the white car, and he was kicked off. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is where the separate but equal clause was established. And so the Supreme Court ruled that there was, if it was only a legal distinction between what was available between whites and blacks, that there was no problem. The Constitution, the 14th Amendment, had not been violated. And if it had not been violated, then there was a wide range of activities in the public sphere and in employment that could persist. So from here, we get separate restaurants. We get separate businesses, so there would be a colored entrance and a white entrance. You get separate theaters. You get separate public spaces, so white parks and black parks. And you can see economically, again, that if you can't use the entire population to promote your business or even have access, and you're required to go to the back or periphery places, if you're required to go to the places that people don't want to go to, you can't actively participate in the economy. And finally, we're going to turn to the policy of redlining. And so often when we're thinking about slavery and we're thinking about Jim Crow, we often think about the southern United States, and we don't think of the northern states. And the policy of redlining was implemented almost explicitly and driven by the U.S. federal government in northern states. And so the policy itself was meant to increase home ownership, to be able for white Americans to be able to own homes in very desirable places. But this excluded blacks, and the policy
U.S.
itself
is not in our past, it's our present. There's a crazy wealth gap between white and black Americans that's tied to home ownership. White Americans hold 7 times the wealth of black Americans, the same ratio as in the civil rights era. And even though black people make up...
So the policy itself was, as this video is short, but it'll explain, the entire policy was predicated, it was based off of whether it was based on your race. So if you wanted to rent and you were black and you had a prime area, you couldn't rent there. It didn't matter if you had credit, it didn't matter if you had any money, it was based on your race. It wasn't economic. So if you were white and you had no money, you would still have a chance to get a loan to be able to buy from that house. But if you were black and you had money, it didn't matter. Once they knew and once they saw that you were black, you could no longer rent. And so obviously, when you're looking about home ownership to be able to build and boost wealth, if you can't own homes, you can't transfer wealth between generations. The same goes with establishing businesses. If I can't own where I am working and where I'm going to employ people, then I can't transfer that as generations go through. So this was another way, this time instituted by the federal government in the North, to disenfranchise, to disallow blacks from enjoying and making use of their citizenship rights. And so now we can play the video if we have time.
Racial segregation in the U.S. is not in our past. It's our present. There's a crazy wealth gap between white and black Americans that's tied to home ownership. White Americans hold 7 times the wealth of black Americans, the same ratio as in the civil rights era. And even though black people make up nearly 13% of the U.S. population, they hold less than 3% of the nation's wealth. Now you have to understand that owning property is the major way American families build wealth. But when state-mandated discrimination stops black people from owning their homes, the growth of their wealth gets halted too. Okay, you have to go way back to see how this happened. When the Great Depression hit, the federal government created public housing to help American families for the first time. They mostly made public housing projects for white people, but there were some made for black folks too. By the mid-1930s, the government was offering subsidized mortgages at a fraction of the price for white families, so they could move into brand new houses in the suburbs. Black people were specifically prohibited from these deals. They instead had to stay in public housing, often paying more for their rent than white families paid in mortgage. On top of that, the practice of redlining grew across the nation. The HOLC created city maps to indicate the level of risk for real estate investments. These maps ranked desirable neighborhoods for lending, such as white suburbs, in green, and marked undesirable or risky neighborhoods, often populated by black communities, in red. As a result, redlining destroyed the possibility of investment wherever black people lived, ruining their chances at growing their wealth, property, or social mobility. Meanwhile, the government backed $120 billion in low-cost home loans between 1934 and 1962. More than 98% of these loans went to white homebuyers. By the time housing segregation was banned in the Fair Housing Act of 1968, it was too little, too late. The damage was already done for generations. The inequity of home ownership had launched a domino effect that made it far too difficult for black families to try and purchase homes in similar suburbs. These neighborhoods had quadrupled in value over time, leaving black Americans far behind. Today, 73% of white households are homeowners, while the percentage for black households is only 45%. Even worse, black people who reached homeownership sometimes faced violence as a result, at the hands of white Americans and police. Racially segregated neighborhoods have a grave impact on many realms of American life. Where you live can determine what kind of education is available for your children, how much wealth you can have, your relationship with law enforcement, and even your own family's health. The biggest takeaway from all of this? Racial segregation and the wealth gap in the U.S. is not just due to personal prejudice or private actions. Instead, it's a direct result of state-sanctioned policies intended to stop black Americans from achieving success that in many ways continues today.
So with that, we will move forward into the civil rights period and how the economic harms that were established during chattel slavery, during Reconstruction, and during the Jim Crow era are now still existing today. And we'll have Demis Selassie take that over.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Justin and Magali, for that presentation. Thus far, you've heard about where we are regarding slavery. You've heard about the atrocities that have existed. Sorry, I've also made the same mistake as my colleague. My name is Demis Selassie. You've heard about the atrocities in Jim Crow, and now we'll talk a little bit about the new Jim Crow. As African Americans and blacks more broadly transitioned into an era no longer bound by policy restrictions on voting and civil liberties, a new form of systemic disenfranchisement gave way. It's called the new Jim Crow. It's both political and economic. It deprived people via a criminal justice system often propagated by racist rhetoric from national political leaders. I have a video here outlining some of the policies and politics, but before we get to the video, I really wanted to highlight a couple of points. First, in 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. After 1980, the situation changed. In the 80s, while the number of arrests of all crimes had risen 28%, the number of arrests for drug offenses rose 126%. According to the Human Rights Watch, the war on drugs caused soaring arrest rates that disproportionately target African Americans due to various factors. This would be a good time to jump right into this video by the New York Times and Jay-Z.
Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the U.S. blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough-on-crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population disproportionately, locking away Black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated $50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to Black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in Black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared the so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
So what we saw in that video was Jay-Z narrating why the war on drugs was a fail and why it disproportionately affected African Americans. So on the next slide, what we'll see is a man to the right by the name of John Ehrlichman. And John Ehrlichman was a counsel and an assistant to the president under President Nixon. In a recent interview, he gave this statement. So for translation, you'll be able to read directly off of the screen, and I'll do the same. You want to know what this was really about, referring to his policies? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This was a glimpse of how the administration took racist and demeaning stances on certain communities. These stances led to severe and destructive policy implications for the Black community. So what does that look like? That looks like since the Nixon administration, the U.S. incarcerated population has increased by 700%. In 2014, African Americans constituted 2.3 million, which is 1/3 of the total correctional population. And if African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rate as whites, prisons and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. This graph here shows the disproportionate effect of incarceration versus Black people in the United States, the national rate, and white, non-Hispanic, and Latino. And as we can see, it's about 5 times their white counterparts and 4 times the national rate. In examining where the United States falls on a global scale, we found some alarming statistics. The United States only has 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of its prisoners. 20% of those prisoners are incarcerated for drug crimes and often nonviolent crimes. If we look at the middle graphic, it outlines the likelihood of imprisonment in your lifetime. Some important statistics to call out are, if you're a black male in America, there's a 1 in 3 chance you will go to prison in your lifetime. If you compare that with white men, it's 1 in 17. Just so you could conceptualize that, so you should picture that, there are currently 330 million people in the United States. There are only 21 million African American males. And finally, just some key takeaways. We really wanted to boil down the information for you guys. First, slavery was a violent and pervasive system embedded in white supremacy. Those systematic efforts to disenfranchise black citizenship, compensation for labor, freedom, access to equal services and equal rights have been continuous throughout history, moving from de jure to de facto racial discrimination. And despite differences in class and a new legal landscape, the systematic oppression of black Africans have an intergenerational impact. And so now my colleagues will be exploring and sharing their findings on implementing reparations in the United States. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Otis Hill, and my group will be doing the implementing reparations portion. This is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a scholar and a professor. This is one of his quotes: "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery." Elias mentioned this earlier. Some slaves were set free for a short amount of time. They went quickly back into slavery. This is a quick overview of what we'll be covering. We're going to go over the conceptual framework for how we would approach reparations, and then a brief history of reparations so far in the U.S., U.S. progression to current reparations, and then we'll do a series of case studies just to show you what those current reparations look like, and then we'll rebut the common arguments against reparations. So this is a framework that we came up with in conjunction with some scholars in the field, and as you can see, the overall goal is black racial justice, and the way we define this is paying a debt owed for slavery and the disenfranchisement of black Americans post-slavery. So the way we split it up is into an internal focus, which focuses on direct restoration straight to black people, and an external focus, which is any sort of indirect restoration to black people. And we split that further up into different sections. We recognize that it will be more difficult to go straight into seeking out monetary reparations, and therefore we kind of set out these other avenues that we could go initially to ease the process. And we'll explore this later on throughout our presentation. And this is a very influential congressman in Pennsylvania, State Representative Chris Rabb. The quote says, "There's no part of the American dream that structurally benefits black people unless we look at exceptions to the rule and not the rule itself." As the former group showed, that is definitely the case with redlining and a lot of the other institutions that have been implemented by the government. And with that, I'll follow it over to the history of reparations portion of the presentation.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Fatou Wage. I want to first start off with saying that there is a history of reparations in the United States. As Elisa Larkins and my colleagues elucidated earlier, in January of 1865, Union General William T. Sherman issued a plan for reparations, also known as the 40 Acres and a Mule Plan. It was a post-Civil War vision, and the plan promised to allocate no more than 40 acres of land to all newly freed persons in the United States. But as was suggested earlier, this promise was very short-lived. But the United States has also taken other contemporary measures around reparations, specifically around the systems that continue to create injustices after slavery. For example, in 2015, the city of Chicago paid $5.5 billion to victims of police brutality. As we have elucidated earlier, the United States has a criminal justice system that is very racialized and polices black and brown bodies specifically. Also, in the state of Florida, a reparations initiative was also brought forth. In 1923, a black town in Florida had a massacre in which a murderous mob of white people destroyed the property of their black residents. Florida paid $2 million to the survivors of that massacre in 1994. Other communities have also been incorporated in the United States reparations plans. For example, after World War II, Congress created the Indian Claims Commission, which was a commission to pay compensation to any federally recognized tribes in the United States. Also, Congress also enacted the Japanese American Extrication Claims Act of 1948, which paid $37 million to Japanese Americans that were interned, and this reached about 26,000 claimants. I also want to just elucidate the progression that the United States has had from the symbolic moments of reparations that have led to the creation of now where we see claims for monetary reparations. And I think we have to understand how each of these moments have led the United States to where we are today. And from our research, we feel that Brazil is probably in the first box right there, which is the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was specifically a moment of elevating Black history in America through cultural celebration. It was a powerful movement. It was a powerful moment for Black artistic reimagination and expression. And then after that, with the image that's right next to it, it's an image to symbolize the Civil Rights Act, which was a legislation that was put forth by the United States federal government in which it outlawed all forms of discrimination based on race, gender, national origin, and it specifically covered discrimination in employment, education, voter registration, and generally in public accommodation spaces. And from that moment, we can transfer over to the Black Power movement, which was a social and political revolution of blackness in the United States. It cultivated Black pride and empowerment, and it was symbolic because it helped reimagine Black history outside of white expression and white history. And the Black Power movement was also accompanied with the Civil Rights movement. And as you all see, this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this moment is very symbolic because it was a moment in which we saw protesting, litigation being brought in the court system, transformation in general attitudes in society, in which Black people were reconciling up against the system to have their rights and protections recognized. And then right over here, we included in the image of President Barack Obama, which was also another symbolic moment in the United States because we see it was a moment in which the United States, despite its history of racism, elected as the 44th president of its country a Black person. Next, we can talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, which was a movement started by 3 Black women to challenge the police violence and the killing of Black and brown peoples. It specifically brought to the forefront the racialized practices of the police force, and it helped build a public discourse on blackness and policing. But now we are at a moment, as I mentioned earlier, where despite all these symbolic iterations of reparations, Black people in the United States still have no entitlement to monetary reparations. And I think we are now seeing the claims for monetary reparations because these key moments that have led us to get to where we are today. I'm now going to specifically talk about some case studies and instances in which we see claims for monetary reparations have been brought forth in the United States, specifically as it relates to local government. As you can see in this graph right here, currently 5 states in the United States have implemented some sort of policy or legislation that has included reparations. And I'll delve into that further. The first one that I would like to talk about is a city in Chicago, specifically a suburb called Evanston. In 2019, Evanston approved a racial equity plan. And the city approved this plan because there was a 3% sales tax on marijuana, and it hoped to use the marijuana tax to generate a race-based reparation plan for its Black residents. It capped the funding at $10 million, and it specifically said that the funding will be used to address the city's practices of redlining, predatory lining, as well as its current educational achievement gap. Although Evanston's population is only 17%, studies show that Black youth consume less marijuana than their white peers, they are more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. Also, segregation cost this city an estimated $4.4 billion US. So, with Evanston taking on this new initiative, there are lessons we can learn from this. We can specifically learn that localities such as cities and other municipalities can be creative in funding and administrating reparations. Cities can create taxation schemes that can have a dual function of 1, financing reparations, as often the argument is that there is no money for reparations, and 2, improving systems that have disproportionately affected Black people, such as the criminal justice system. In Pennsylvania, there's also an example that we can see. State Representative Chris Dabb is introducing a reparations-based legislation in the state of Pennsylvania as well. It is specifically a plan that is targeted towards all Pennsylvania residents of African descent. It functions as a form of retribution for those who suffered from past and current government practices and legal outcomes that continue to disproportionately disadvantage African Americans. Specifically, this plan seeks for a formal apology from the Pennsylvania General Assembly. It also creates a commission that would determine the financial impact of racial injustices. And it also provides non-cash benefits to all of Pennsylvania's African American residents. And specifically, the benefits that it provides are tax benefits. And in order to qualify for this, residents have to provide some sort of documentation verifying their ethnicity as Black. There are also lessons that we can learn from this. We can see that state law can also be a space to further reparations plans. Specifically, as state law and federal law were two institutions that were involved with furthering slavery and the legacy of slavery. States can create reparation plans and establish their own sorts of residency requirements to determine who should be able to qualify for these plans. Also in Pennsylvania, interestingly enough, and specifically in the city of Philadelphia, in 2005, the city implemented a law called the Slavery Era Business and Corporation Insurance Disclosure Law. This law specifically stated that corporations would have to disclose their involvement with the history of slavery. As we all know, private actors have also been involved with administrating the institution of slavery. And through the Pennsylvania disclosure law, we see that states can be very creative in holding private actors accountable. And in so doing, they can help create the system in which we can better finance reparation plans. But the problem with the Pennsylvania disclosure law is that it doesn't, corporations have to opt in. They have to volunteer to be able to disclose their history of slavery. But I think overall, this legislation that State Representative Chris Dabb is introducing is a very robust example of what can happen when state governments also take ownership and accountability for their involvement with slavery. Now, I would like to transfer it over to my colleague, Jocelyn Walcott, who will continue to provide another case study. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Walcott. And in this section, we are going to examine proposals for reparations on the national level, which have taken two forms primarily: one, legislation, and two, presidential candidate proposals. So starting with the legislation, in 1989, House of Representatives Bill 40 named the Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African American Acts was introduced into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is the lower legislative chamber and is the first body of lawmakers that have to have majority support for a bill for it to become a law. The bill authorizes $12 million to establish a 13-member commission to study the continued effects of slavery and racial discrimination and make recommendations for redress or remedy. The bill has symbolic importance. The 40 in the bill's name references the unfulfilled promise of 40 acres and a mule that my colleagues and others have mentioned. The bill was reintroduced in 2017 after movements like the Black Lives Matter movement and the election of President Trump highlighted the explicit racism and the plight of Black people in America. And the plight of Black people and explicit racism was brought into the mainstream public discourse. The bill was introduced both in the House of Representatives and the higher legislative chamber, the Senate. So there are aspects about the reparation bill that are worth celebrating, and there are also challenges. So since the Reconstruction era that my colleagues mentioned, the H.R. 40 bill for reparations is the only legislation that has been introduced into the Senate, which demonstrates that support for reparations is rising to a national level. However, there are also challenges. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is adamantly against the bill and argues that redress for slavery and Jim Crow segregation were gained through the Civil Rights Acts. Republicans also argue that reparations proposed by Democrats should only be paid by Democrats, and we will rebut some of these arguments in later slides. So as a takeaway, the federal government can initiate commissions to explore the historical manifestation of slavery and other forms of racial oppression of Black people. And as lawyers, you all know that the legislative element is crucial in the fight for reparations. However, it is important to keep in mind that legislation for reparations must take into account party politics and potential political alliances against the reparations movement. Therefore, legislation must be drafted in a way that it cannot be easily undone by political parties in opposition after the legislation is passed. So there was a congressional hearing for the reparations bill, H.R. 40, that held a panel for testimony from Black activists, advocates, politicians, and economists. Black author and activist Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is pictured here, said, and I quote, "Many of us would love to be taxed for the things we are solely and individually responsible for. But we are American citizens and thus bound to a collective enterprise that extends beyond our individual and personal reach." Danny Glover, a Black American actor and activist who is married to a Brazilian, Asegi Bomani, also provided testimony at the congressional hearing. National plans for reparations are also being proposed through Democratic presidential election candidates. Currently, there are elections happening across the U.S. to determine which Democratic presidential candidate will run against President Trump in the general election in November. There are two, I heard some applause. There are two frontrunners in the Democratic race to go up against President Trump: former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders, who we will get further into their plans for reparation. So first we'll start off with Senator Bernie Sanders' approach. And Bernie Sanders is by far the most progressive Democratic candidate. However, he has no unique plan for reparations. But he said if elected, he would support a reparations bill in his presidency. But instead of creating his own, Bernie argues for policies that would help distressed communities, including Black communities. The challenge with Bernie's approach is that he has no explicit slavery reparations plan, and his alternative policies are focused almost exclusively on class and not race. Next, we'll move on to the approach of former Vice President Joe Biden, who also does not have a plan for reparations, but says America should take actions to deal with systemic issues that make it harder for Black Americans. So although his proposal does specifically address some systemic issues that Black Americans face, particularly disenfranchisement that my colleagues have mentioned, like Senator Sanders, he does not have a unique plan for slavery reparations. Next, we will move on to current Senator Cory Booker, and former candidate, and he is also a black senator. He is the one who championed and introduced the H.R. 40 bill in the Senate. Now the issue with his plan is that the bill proposes a study of reparations and their effects, but studying alone does not guarantee that there will be any progress or change in the law. Next, we will move on to former candidate Elizabeth Warren, who supported reparations and the H.R. 40 bill, but again, did not have her own unique plan. She insisted that the American Housing and Economics Mobility Act, which would create a housing program that would offer aid to first-time home buyers in communities affected by redlining. My colleagues mentioned redlining earlier, but just as a recap, redlining was a form of housing discrimination against Black Americans. So again, we're seeing with Warren's proposal that she is not specifically focused on slavery reparations and does have a plan, but her plan is centered on housing and is not comprehensive for all, if we're looking for a complete racial justice kind of platform or plan. And finally, former candidate Marianne Williamson was the first Democratic candidate in the 2020 election to mention reparations as a prominent part of her platform. She proposed skipping the study of reparations and, the study of slavery in the United States, and instead initiating monetary reparations right away. She suggested $200 to $500 billion over 20 years to be paid to the descendants of slaves. And during a presidential candidate debate, she said payments are, quote, a debt that is owed. The challenges to this approach are twofold. One, this approach is very unpopular. And also, this approach does not consider non-monetary aspects of the greater goal for Black racial justice. So, transitioning from these examples, we have some high-level takeaways. So, as Mr. Ferrari mentioned earlier, when Black people mobilize together and the Black vote becomes crucial to political success, politicians will be incentivized to appeal to Black voters and include Black issues in their platforms. So, Black people must use broad-based injustices to pressure candidates to adopt comprehensive policies proposed by Black people that are sufficiently protected from political opposition. And so now I will turn it over to my colleague Otis, who will talk about private and religious educational institutions and reparations.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So now I'll be discussing religious and educational institutions. And this is a very important section because as I've watched these presentations throughout the day, I've noticed there's a common theme between Brazil and the US, and one of those main things is education. We cannot move forward unless we know what happened in the past, and we're not going to get any support without knowing what happened in the past. And that's kind of where we're at in the United States right now. In 2003, Brown University was the first educational institution to study their past history with slavery. And the important thing about that is it really only takes one. Once they discovered their roots to slavery, it would cause a cascading effect. Now there are dozens of other universities that have felt the pressure from students to study their history with slavery. And honestly, most of the universities in America were founded on slavery. And now they cannot hide that fact. Unfortunately, with that good side comes the bad side. The bad side is that despite the uncovering of these very strong ties to slavery, very few of these institutions have felt it necessary to implement actual reparations programs. A lot of them are doing very symbolic things like naming buildings after former slaves or giving out memorials or building memorials for their acts as a way of apologizing, but they're not willing to take the next step. But what I saw out of this is really that the best way to reach universities and schools and these kind of institutions is you have to get the students in and then get them mobilized in pressuring the administration to research their history and disclose it. And once you get one institution to do that, you start to get more to do it, and that makes a big difference. Now, I did say that there is very little movement on the reparations front, but there is one, this university has instituted some form of reparations. And that's partly due to a unique circumstance. A lot of the slaves that were helping with building and working at these universities, there's no documentation for them. All they have is the first name for them. There's no way to tie them to descendants today. Georgetown was unique because it was a religious institution as well. It was tied to Roman Catholicism, and they kept very, very neat records. This ended up biting them in the, oh, I won't say the word, but it hurt them later on because it had their full names of every single slave. It had how much they paid for them. It had what they did for work. It had what ship they came in on. It had everything. And they couldn't hide it once the information started to trickle out. The students came forward with a petition to increase their own tuition in order to start a reparations program. That's the good side, that the students felt the need to actually grab a hold of this cause, but the issue is that the university found a way to spin this in their favor. They decided, you know what, we're not going to accept the students' proposal to increase their tuition, a way of tying the students to the cause and the university to the cause. They said, you know what, we're going to reach out and we're going to get donations, and we're going to use those donations to fund this program. That distances the university from the responsibility. That none of their money, none of their responsibility is tied to this cause. So it is a step in the right direction, but it's not all the way there. And then we also have another case. This is the Princeton Theological Seminary. It was a religious institution, and they discovered that many of the founders and early leaders used slave labor despite speaking out against it, which is not surprising. There was a lot of hypocrisy going on back then and even now. So with pressure from the public community, they decided to give out scholarships, fellowships, and here they took an additional step. They actually proposed curriculum changes to actually teach the current students there about their past and the slavery. But the main issue here is, although you've reached somewhat of a form of monetary reparations here, which is a monumental step, you can see that when they did their own estimations, they estimated that almost 40% of their endowment, which is basically the money they have in reserve, came from slavery. Yet they only allocated less than 1/4% to this program. So there's a shocking disparity there, and that's not the kind of monetary reparations that we should be happy with. So in closing, it's a great thing to get the symbolic reparations as well as getting the first monetary reparations, and taking note here that this is from a private institution, not the government. But it's still a step forward, and it's the main takeaway is that reaching the students and having the students put the pressure on their own administration is probably the best and most effective way to reach these institutions. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Jonathan, who will cover social media.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Ford, and I just want to summarize briefly what we've talked about. We've been focused on how reparations can be implemented in the American context, how it's been implemented, and what that could mean in the context of Brazil and internationally. And so we've covered a number of case studies, both with presidential candidates, state and local governments, and then Otis just shared situations with private entities, private universities, institutions. But we don't want to forget different mediums. And social media is key in building support, building recognition in any movement at this point in history. Just a quick quote from Bell Hooks, the author and activist, and it says, "Since anti-racist individuals did not control mass media, the media became the primary tool that would be used and is still used to convince black viewers and everyone else of black inferiority." And I think the idea from this quote that we want to leave with is we want to take control of different forms of media to spread a message around reparations, to build greater understanding and greater empathy around the reparations cause. One case study that we'll look at briefly is the American descendants of slaves. It's a small, controversial movement in the United States that's built a lot of momentum on the internet through social media. First off, quick show of hands, has anyone heard of American descendants of slaves, ADOS? Okay, so we have one person outside of our group. Has anyone, well, let me ask this. Quick show of hands, how many people in the room were born, grew up in Brazil? Okay, so just about everyone grew up here in Brazil. So whether you know it or not, an interesting dynamic in the United States is, of course, it's a country of immigrants. It's a country where a lot of people come from a lot of different places, and there are a number of black people who were descendants of slaves. One of the challenges and opportunities with America is to build that international coalition even within the borders of the United States. ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, has emerged by leveraging Twitter. They use Facebook, they use YouTube to share stories around what they want, which is first, reparations for the descendants of slaves in the United States, and secondly, they want to close the racial wealth gap in the United States between black people and white people. Now, the positive thing about this movement is they have helped to restart a conversation and add a little bit more context to maybe some complicated questions in the United States around how slavery has impacted people today. Rather than dealing with just symbolic measures, ADOS has started to try and push the conversation of how would reparations be delivered, who would get reparations in the United States. They've capitalized, they've used social frustration in the United States to involve young people who may not be involved in social movements otherwise. However, the challenge with ASOS is they oftentimes do not support a Pan-African vision of reparations. And we understand that there needs to be a unified coalition and unique messaging from different areas to really deliver a unified message and get behind reparations on the whole. And so the practical takeaway here has been that social media is a key tool and it needs to be used in any movement with regards to reparations and advancing the cause and bringing about a deeper understanding of culture from different parts of the world. So just to close here, we've covered once again the history of reparations in the United States. We've touched on a number of case studies about how reparations has occurred within the United States. And to be clear, we haven't in the United States had full reparations like we imagine. The opportunity is to look at some of the smaller versions of reparations and think about how to build more momentum towards a bigger vision that we are seeing progress towards. And so from the case studies that we've looked into, we've come to this framework where we start off with the high-level Black racial justice goal. And we want to see overall racial justice throughout the African diaspora. Again, there's an internal focus and an external focus to this. The internal focus is about bringing direct monetary assets to Black people. It's about undoing the problems that occurred in education, in political power, in voting, through history. And then there's about the symbolic element. We want and we believe that any reparations movement or any proper reparations deserves an apology. There needs to be some degree of the government coming out and saying, we apologize. The external focus focuses on similar areas, and we're thinking about things like increased funding to historically Black universities in the United States. We're thinking about education for white people around the history of what happened to Black people in America. And again, removal of statues, removal of the symbols that uphold white supremacy in the United States and across the world. Once again, we believe that social media is a big tool in all of this, and it starts with that communication and that understanding, but it has to go towards this broader vision of overall reparations. And just briefly, some common arguments that we see in the United States regarding reparations and potential counter arguments. We may hear that America has already provided an apology or a reparation of some sort. And we would argue in response that the harm in America extends beyond just slavery. It still goes on to this day, and there's still an opportunity to solve that. A second common argument we may hear is no one today was alive during slavery, and so no one today should be responsible for slavery. However, we would argue that America was unjustly enriched by slavery, and whites inherited and still profit from much of what slavery and what happened after slavery created. And then finally, a big counter argument to reparations is it's impossible to implement reparations. It's too complicated, and we live in a post-racial society where you can't point to who's responsible. We would argue that other groups have received reparations in the United States and around the world. Governments do complicated things all the time, and so it is very possible. And once again, racial disparities still exist today. And so, in conclusion, this is a quote brought out from an article in the Washington Post. Basically, the idea from some of the universities and the reparations programs that we've seen in the United States demonstrates a pattern with regards to how reparations have been implemented. There are 4 areas or 4 parts to this pattern. First, we typically see an institution that was to blame in the past and still exists today. Secondly, we see a discrete and identifiable population that can show the harm. Third, we see a community that can fight for the people who were harmed. And fourth, at the local level, activists can put pressure on institutions, and decision makers, however, are often shielded from criticism. So basically, the people who are doing grassroots work are very important in any reparations movement. And so our takeaway here is that while the U.S. federal government has not delivered on a full reparations program for the Black people in America, there is a number of examples of how activists can effectively continue the work that's been moving along, how we can leverage culture, how we can leverage politics, and how we can use social media and communications to continue this fight for reparations. We want to continue to build empathy. We want to fight for a full framework for reparations, not just symbolic means of redress. And there also needs to be political protection so that any reparations that are delivered are not immediately taken away by some other institution or group in society. And with that, we'll transition into the last portion of our presentation, the case study.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olivia Bethay, and my colleagues and I are here to present to you on a very exciting case study, or at least a unique case study, in that it involves 2 international parties discussing reparations, but in a New York federal court. This was a case that got many countries excited, as it potentially offered a vehicle for reparations, and so we're going to analyze it for you in this segment. Very excited to be before you because this is the final segment of our presentation. We're going to start this segment with a quick activity. So I'm going to ask 3 questions. And if you feel that the answer to the question is yes, then I'm just going to ask you to wave your hand first. Is the slave trade a commercial activity? Is the removal and selling of human remains a commercial activity? Some people say yes. It's okay. And finally, are museum exhibits a direct consequence of history? Yes? No? I see some people say yes. So I will start off by providing the facts of this case. In 1884, Germany continued its participation in the transatlantic slave trade by continuing its expansion into northwest Africa, which is modernly known as Namibia. And for 15 years, the German government tortured the Ovaherero and Nama tribes. These are 2 indigenous groups native to that area. The Germans took their resources, their land, their cattle. Of course, this resulted in battles, murders, and even sexual assaults. When German soldiers would encounter male groups of the Ovaherero and Nama tribes, they would shoot them to death immediately. They would then take the women far away from like the mainlands, banish them, starve them, and sexually assault them. And it wasn't until 85 years later, in 1985, that the United Nations recognized this atrocity, this genocide, as genocide. And it's the physical remains, the bones of these bodies, that become the subject of today's case. These bones are currently showcased in New York. Well, they were at the time of the case. Showcased in New York at the American Museum of Natural History. I'll also note some of the other atrocities the German government committed against these people, aside from the ethnic cleansing, include medical experimentation and concentration camps. In 2017, which was about 110 years after the Germans first entered Namibia, plaintiffs brought this case before the New York federal courts, and I'm going to walk you through the law that they used to frame their argument. The relevant law is called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which I'll refer to as the FSIA. And this is a codification of US foreign policy interest. It's a codification of the US not wanting to interfere with the sovereignty of other nations unless the US wants to. And those exceptions are also codified. There's 6 of them. 2 of them are relevant here. The first is called the takings, well, it's called the commercial activities exception, and the second is the takings exception. I'll just read the main line from the statute, which is, a foreign state shall be immune from the jurisdictions of courts of the United States or the states unless these exceptions apply.
Oi, boa tarde. Meu nome é Eduarda Lag e eu vou falar sobre o resto do caso, mas eu vou falar em inglês, desculpa. So as Olivia mentioned, the FSIA has some exceptions. The commercial activity exception is the one that we will be focusing on today. for purposes of our case, when you're reading the commercial exception slide, the third exception is the one that actually applies. So it's the one that says, or upon an act outside the territory of the United States in connection with the commercial activity of the foreign state elsewhere, and that act causes a direct effect in the United States. That means when there is a direct effect in relation to a commercial activity, the foreign state can be found liable within the United States. All right. So we are going to go over what the plaintiffs alleged under this commercial activity exception. So first, to establish commercial activity, they argued that Germany's involvement in bone trading and the construction of a railway in the region was inherently commercial because it involved the construction, purchase, and sale of goods and services which were a direct result of Germany's crimes against the indigenous people. Second, the plaintiffs also alleged to prove direct effect to the United States, they highlighted that, one, those harmed and their descendants are residing in the United States in New York, and two, that New York City, a leading location in research study of genocide, is utilizing the remains of oppressed people to conduct that research, and therefore Germany's commercial actions have a direct effect on the United States. However, unfortunately, the court did not uphold for the indigenous people. Many of the arguments that the court makes turns on legal technicalities that we are going to lay out right now. The court says, even if the bone trade was commerce, and even if Germany did participate in the bone trade, it cannot be proven that the bones in the museum are the ones that Germany used to conduct the bone trade. The court held that there was no directness to the United States for this reason. Merely having the location of the class members, the plaintiffs, in the United States or the remains in the United States is not enough to show a direct effect in the United States. Directness is associated with time and an immediate connection between the German government's actions and the activity that occurred in the United States. That being said, this argument turns on the proximate cause argument under US law. That means that any non-state actor can break the causal chain. Therefore, the transfer to the American Museum is not an immediate consequence of the genocide. The remains were owned by a private actor, not the German government. While Germany killed these people and expropriated their remains, the remains got into the hands of a private citizen that then transferred those remains to the United States. Therefore, the transfer was not directly from a German official to the United States. Now we're going to transition to our second legal claim that the plaintiffs put forward.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Reed, and I'm going to be discussing the takings exception, which is the second exception that was discussed earlier. So specifically, the takings exception is essentially related to the specific bones and other materials that were expropriated from the sites that the plaintiffs are from. And to prove this exception, the plaintiff must demonstrate, 1, that the rights and property are at issue, 2, that the property was quote-unquote taken, 3, that the taking was in violation of international law, and 4, which is a bifurcated claim that the plaintiffs need to prove, that A, the property is present in the United States in connection with a commercial activity carried on in the United States by the foreign state, or that the property is owned or operated by an agency or instrumentality of the foreign state, and that agency or instrumentality is engaged in a commercial activity in the United States. So I'm just going to preface that it is a very detailed exception, so I'm going to try and take it slow to go through each one. So specifically in this case, our plaintiffs had some similar claims related to what my colleague discussed earlier. So the property taken in this situation are cattle, land, and human remains. The property was taken, and the taking is in violation of international law. So these first three things were inherent in the plaintiff's initial claim. Specifically, the plaintiffs argued for the fourth point that the bone trade was a commercial activity and that the funds of the bone trade in the U.S. were directly rooted to their activities in New York City. They also argued that the revenues from the trade were used to purchase apartments in New York City. Now, I want to point out, which is related to what my colleague at Waters said earlier, the court refused to consider the bone trade argument because the plaintiffs failed to make a clear connection between German commercial activity in the plaintiff's home country and the remains stolen during the bone trade. Now, I want to highlight that the plaintiffs did ask for an opportunity to submit more information regarding that specific connection in their complaint. However, that request was denied. So, regarding the takings exception, the court only considered the apartments in New York City. They did not consider the remains that were stolen in the bone trade. So the court held, first, it assumed that the taking was a violation of international law because property losses as a result of genocide are generally considered violations of international law. The court acknowledged that this may be later proven as untrue, but it cited to several other cases that accepted this as true, so it decided to go ahead and assume that in this case. So that is regarding the first 3 points we have up here. Now, despite that initial holding, the court next held that the revenues from the bone trade were commingled in the German treasury and that the commingled funds were used to purchase the apartments that are in fact in the U.S. So, as I stated earlier, the plaintiffs claims that the funds or revenues that they acquired from selling the bones and otherwise handling the materials that they acquired. Okay, I'll go ahead and just briefly summarize what I said in case you all did not have the translation. So the court first held that the funds were commingled in the German treasury and that money was used to purchase the apartments in the U.S. So what that means is the court is acknowledging that the revenues acquired from the activities alleged against the German government against the plaintiffs are directly related to the apartments that were purchased in New York City. And therefore, the property that the plaintiffs alleged were a direct result of the harms against them. There is in fact a connection, a physical connection to that property in the United States. Next, the court held that the nature of the conduct is not commercial or conduct in which private players would engage. Thus, because the apartments are used to promote governmental and cultural ends. So what this means is, despite the government finding that the revenues from the bone trade was directly connected to the purchase of these apartments in New York City, they still held that that activity was not commercial. Specifically, they said it was not commercial because the apartments in New York City were being used to promote governmental and cultural ends. They reasoned that the holding in the alternative, basically if they held that they were commercial purchases, that would defy the general purpose of the FSIA, which my colleague Olivia stated at the beginning. The overall statute, the purpose of it is to preserve foreign relations and essentially to make foreign countries or nations immune to the judgments of U.S. state and federal courts. Thus, the U.S. held under the takings exception that it could not exercise subject matter jurisdiction and therefore hear the plaintiff's claims. I'm now going to transition to our critiques of this case based upon, now that we have an understanding of what the court held and what the claims are. I'm going to transition to my colleague Eduardo to begin discussing our critiques.
So, as Shannon mentioned, we're going to now critique the case because the court did not favor the indigenous group in this case. For the commerciality argument, the court did hold that the bones that were from the genocide that the German country obtained that ended up in the United States was not a direct effect that could be linked back to Germany. We critique this and say that the bones would have never existed in the United States but for Germans' commercial activity in the bone trade, and that activity should taint, that genocide should taint the rest of this proximate cause argument, that there should not be a break in the causal chain in the commercial causation. There is a physical connection when you hand bones to someone and that someone hands them to someone else. So here the court is choosing to read what a direct effect to the United States from a foreign country very narrowly. The court, after reading many cases on what constitutes a direct effect in the United States, the United States courts tend to read this narrowly, that when things are direct, they must be negotiated in New York, the accounts must be payable in the United States, and usually those payments must also be withdrawn in the United States, showing that the foreign state must have a direct obligation to the United States in order to satisfy this prong and to be held liable in the United States court system. As we said, this is a very narrow interpretation of what a direct effect in the United States is, because as we mentioned, they're not wanting to hold these foreign countries liable and have reparations for these groups. Next, we're going to transition to the critique that Shannon read out.
Hello, back again to discuss the taking exception. Now, this is just a reminder that under the takings exception, the U.S. could not exercise jurisdiction where there was no connection to commercial activity. In this case, the court found that the nature of the conduct was not commercial, in part because the specific apartments that were purchased, some of the contracts involved with purchasing an apartment, they considered those to be incidental and not commercial. Now, our first critique is of the plaintiff's argument. So essentially, specifically, how they decided to prove that the purchase in New York was commercial. Instead of just arguing that the apartment purchase was in connection to a commercial activity, they could have potentially argued that the purchase itself was commercial, that the act of purchasing property in the United States is a commercial activity, in addition to more incidental things related to the properties that the plaintiffs decided to talk about. Since the court already acknowledged a connection between revenues derived from the bone trade and the apartment purchases, that may have created a more favorable outcome on that issue. In addition, the court notes elsewhere in their opinion that the hiring or leasing of property can be considered commercial activity. Nevertheless, the court makes several contradictory statements of the law and legal reasoning for determining what is quote unquote commercial activity. Under the statute, a commercial activity means either a regular course of commercial conduct or a particular commercial transaction or act. It sounds pretty plain, right? The commercial character of an activity shall be determined by reference to the nature of the course of the conduct, not by reference to its purpose. So to better explain, to more simply explain that, what is commercial is strictly the conduct. Is it transactional? Is it a sale? Is it a purchase? Something like that, that on its face is a transactional activity. The definition explicitly states that the purpose of the purchase or the conduct is not meant to be, the purpose of that is not meant to be considered. So, while the statute states that, the court specifically and explicitly references the purpose of the apartments, the purpose of the apartments and the way it was used as a reason for why it was not commercial. They specifically cite that it was used for cultural promotion and to house people, which those people were government officials, but they consider that to be cultural promotion and not an example of a commercial activity. We think this analysis is incorrect and was an attempt to circumvent the more logical conclusion that the apartment purchase was commercial and an action that a private party would engage in the same situation. This is especially true because German diplomats and other sovereign activities occur on the premises. And finally, more broadly, the commerciality definition is inconsistent with the definition of commerciality in the commerciality exception that my colleague Eduardo was just explaining. If you recall, her definition of commerciality was different in that it did not factor in the private party action or some of the other technicalities that I just discussed. So with that, I'm going to close our discussion of our specific critiques of these individual exceptions. And I'm going to give the floor to my colleague Olivia to begin discussing some general critiques we noticed in conducting our research and how this case may affect reparations in the U.S. and Brazil.
Hi everyone. So I'm here to take a step back and provide our critique of the overall decision, not necessarily a critique of the granularities of the decision, but our overall takeaways. So first, we find that these cases turn on unsupported legal technicalities. And I want you to think back to our opening activity where I asked you, what is commercial activity? What is a direct activity? And ultimately, the answer is we don't know. We look to precedent for tests to figure that out. But the body of precedent upon which courts are using to make these definitions and these contexts, the context of ethnic cleansing and genocide and slavery and racial injustice, are not, it's a completely different body of law. We're referencing a body of law subjected to more traditional transactions. So if it's not a traditional contract, if it's not such as one to build an oil mine or what have you, it's simply trying to reach, using an inappropriate vehicle to reach a desired end. Consequently, we propose that effective reparations implementation would require an alternative forum or even an alternative court system, one where the law is actually meant to address instances of racial injustice, and one that is meant to recognize the gravity of the circumstances at hand, and not a body of law and not a forum that's meant to unpack corporate contracts. The second of the three critiques I'm going to present you acknowledges that racial attitudes ultimately affect the success with which you can implement reparations. And we noted some differences by cultural context In the US government specifically codified rights withheld from Black Americans during slavery in the Jim Crow era. And there was no system of positive rights meant to redress that harm. This system forced Americans to recognize the racial categorization and the system's and society's racial hierarchy. By contrast, racism in Brazil doesn't seem similarly codified. And consequently, the Brazilian government created an option to identify with racial categories to redress racial injustice. And ultimately, we see that attitudes of self-identification in the US and Brazil vary and affect the success of reparations. So that's something that we wanted to keep in mind. Lastly, we're just not too sure that the US is the best forum as it stands today to pave the way for international reparations. One reason is that most federal judges in the United States are white men without the technical or cultural knowledge to properly consider the international circumstances at hand. And so ultimately we have a concern that they just won't be properly sympathetic to international instances of racial injustice. And one reason we feel that way is because domestic instances of racial injustice have not been properly redressed. And so even if the US were to pave the way for international reparations, we don't feel that the US would be a sustainable role model so long as reparations to African Americans have not been paid. And finally, I reached the last slide of the entire group's presentation, and I'm going to run through the takeaways from each of the three groups. So first, the United States foreign policy interests do not favor interfering with the sovereignty of other nations for the sake of reparations. Second, FSIA is not the ideal statute for pursuing reparations. Courts traditionally uphold the statute's exceptions in the context of transactions and US-based contracts. Third, differences in the enforcement of racial classifications in the US and Brazil are key to informing approaches to reparations in both countries. And lastly, to date, the United States is not a sustainable role model for reparations internationally because reparations have not been delivered to Black Americans in response to the transatlantic slave trade. We do have an offering for a next step. We found one case which held that Hungary's seizure of the collection in pursuit of the destruction of Jewish people satisfied the first and second requirements of the takings exception. So perhaps there is some hope there. Thank you for your time. Okay, these are our three major highlights. Black Americans have experienced severe harms which require compensation. The US federal government, as we've said, hasn't delivered on formal reparations to Black people. And lastly, the United States foreign policy interests under FSIA don't support using FSIA as a vehicle for reparations. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, one, two.
We can do it next time in the conversation.
Yeah.
Top. Okay. Let's take a picture, everybody here. Bem criatiano.
Vai terminar?
Nós vamos fazer uma foto. Regina. Professora, teacher, Yes, come here. You are the teacher. Bora aí. Não.
Algumas pessoas podiam ficar sentadas aí. Eu acho
pode, deixa eu olhar na Professora!
Pode tirar uma com a minha? Valeu, obrigada.
Okay, thank you. So, para agradecer os nossos tradutores, Dr. Marcos Salgado, que é advogado e veio fazer a tradução hoje voluntariamente, e Eduarda Lage. A Cratiana está oferecendo 2 livros aqui. A gente vai, a Cratiana está oferecendo os 2 livros aqui. Eu vou chamar agora. Ele vai fazer.
Eu também lembro.
Hein?
Eu também tenho umas coisas que eu quero
Tá. Eles vão. Mas é que se eles vêm traduzir, não tem ninguém para traduzir. Por favor, aqui. Tem uma roda de conversa agora com advogados jovens. Os tradutores aqui, Marcos Salgados. Espera aí, gente, eu tenho que fazer uma coisa. Tem um lanche ali também, there's some lunch ali, já estão consumindo. E tem que fazer rápido para fazer. Então, eu queria já então chamar a roda de conversa com os advogados jovens. Cadê a Marta?
Round table with young lawyers.
Marta, pode chamar os advogados daqui. Eles vão poder participar.
Bom.
Eles vão para lá de novo, os tradutores. Tá? Ok, então, mas eu tenho que apresentar os advogados.
Oi, tudo bem? Agora a gente vai ter uma roda de conversa. A gente convidou algumas advogadas muito especiais para este evento.
Não quero apresentar. Quem tem que entender são os alunos negros, não somos nós brasileiros. A roda de conversa é para eles.
Não, então a gente vai fazer uma roda de conversa com os estudantes americanos e com advogados jovens advogados afro-brasileiros. Então, a gente vai fazer uma circle.
Faz aqui mesmo. Senão vai perder. Faz aqui mesmo, senão vai demorar muito.
Posso levar meu certificado?
Pode.
O tempo é sempre um problema, não?
Pessoal.
Oh, obrigada. Opa, obrigada. Adame. Obrigada aí. Tudo de bom. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Queretiane.
Let me get around.
Cadê os advogados? Vamos? Vamos lá, então. Marta, cadê os advogados brasileiros? Cadê? Não, mas é que a gente tem que dar sequência. Vamos agora. Mas eu quero saber os nomes. Chama, depois você põe isso aí.
As pessoas vão comer, né?
Pois é, não, vai fazer tudo junto. Vai fazer tudo junto. Chama eles pra cá, depois você põe as coisas. Não são as pessoas.
Vamos montar a mesa? Vamos montar a mesa? Chama